barakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we'll be talking about Ibn Rushd, once again one of the great figures of Islam, or great figures that Islamic civilization has produced. You know, with all the great figures in history, whether they're Muslim or not, they have always found supporters and also critiques. Supporters have really promoted their ideas, sometimes quite fervently, and the critics felt that they had to respond to their ideas, like they just could not ignore these great figures and their writings and influence. And Ibn Rushd is one of those. I think all the figures that we have covered fall into that category. They have their supporters, they have their critics. Having critics doesn't mean they were wrong, or they did really bad things, or they wrote, or they misled the ummah. It's just that they thought differently on issues. Imam Ghazali, which we have covered also, he says that if there's a person who claims to be a scholar, and all they do is just transmit the views of other people, and they do not produce their own original contribution, stay away from them. Because they're just carriers of someone else's views, they don't have views themselves. So therefore they should not be classified as scholars. I mean, you know, when you're studying in university or in ISRA, we encourage you to quote the opinions of other scholars. But at the end, you have to form it all together, synthesize it, and produce your own original critical comments. So in that sense, we all need to come to a conclusion. And these great figures have strong opinions, and they forcefully argued their cases, and Ibn Rushd is one of those. And when you really look at all civilizations, let's say the Western civilization, who are the main contributors that made the thought and the knowledge base of this civilization? It's really about 70, 80 key figures. And in a sense, perhaps Islamic civilization has produced even greater number of significant men and women in that sense. It's just that we're in a different turn in civilizational history at the moment in time. His full name is Abdul Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmed ibn Rushd. As usual, Muslim scholars have very long names, and we just know them. We just know him as simply Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, his Latinized name in Europe. He was born in Andalusia, or Andalus, in Cordoba, in 1126. And he died in 72 years of age in 1198. He comes from a respected scholarly family. His grandfather and his father after him were the chief judge in the city of Cordoba. So they were scholarly and well respected in that city. And they were chief judges for about 4 decades. It's a very important family. And as usual in those times, you start with a madrasa education. They memorize the Quran, study hadith, Arabic literature, and then they move on to fiqh and other areas. In addition to this type of madrasa education, Ibn Rushd also studied philosophy with Ibn Bajjar and Ibn Tufayl. And he also studied medicine with Ibn Zuhur. And these were like really major figures. They say that, scholars say that Ibn Bajjar, Ibn Tufayl, and Ibn Rushd are the greatest philosophers that Andalusia has produced. Ibn Rushd began his career by Ibn Tufayl's referencing. Ibn Tufayl is famous for, I don't know if anyone heard of it, Hayb ibn Yaksan novel. He wrote this story about a boy. There was a conflict in a land. The mother of a boy puts his son in a basket into sea, and the waves take this baby into this deserted island. And the baby is looked after by a gazelle, and that grows up. As he grows up, he starts learning about his environment. He learns how to make fire. When the gazelle that looked after him dies, he understands. He looks at, well, he was living and he's now dead. He dissects his body and says, where is that thing that made him alive? And then from that he understands that there must be something called spirit. And basically he then reasons that there is a creator of everything. So his point is that there's one truth, and you can come to truth. You don't have to be taught. You just can get that from wisdom and reason and your observation around the world, of the natural world. And then a scholar lands in the same island, a Muslim scholar who knows Sharia, Quran really well, and he teaches them language, and they start talking, and the scholar is surprised that everything that he knows from the Quran, Hay actually learned by being in this island, naturally. So he's trying to prove that there's two ways to truth. Revelation gives you that truth, but also hikmah, as they called it, knowledge of the world through reason also would give you that. This is a very famous novel. Actually, it was translated into Latin European languages and read widely in Europe. And it's also inspired Robinson Crusoe stories and things like that. So Ibn Tufayl himself was a major figure. And one day Ibn Tufayl made a very important suggestion to Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd actually explains this in his writings. He says, Abu Bakr ibn Tufayl summoned me one day and told me that he had heard the commander of the faithful, which is the Caliph in Andalusia, which also at that time ruled much of North Africa and Western Africa, so it was a bit of an empire. He says, the commander of the faithful complaining that the disjointedness of Aristotle's mode of expression, or that of the translators, and the resultant obscurity of his intentions. So Aristotle is very hard to understand in his original writings. You need a commentary, someone to teach you. So he continues. He said that if someone took on these books, who could summarize them and clarify their aims after first thoroughly understanding them himself, people would have an easier time comprehending them. So this is what Caliph is saying. Well, Caliph was trying to understand these books and he couldn't. That's why he's asking someone to help him. So Ibn Tufayl says, if you have the energy, you do it. I'm confident you can, because I know that what a good mind and devoted character you have, and how dedicated you are to the art. That is art of philosophy. You understand that only my great age declares my office and my commitment to another task that I think even more vital keeps me from doing it myself. So Ibn Tufayl is basically saying, I'm too busy, because he was the vizier and the physician of the Caliph of Andalusia. And later, actually, Ibn Tufayl suggested to the Caliph that Ibn Rushd would replace him after he passed away. So he's saying that I'm busy, I'm a physician, I'm a vizier, and I've got this other big task as well. You do it. You write commentaries on Aristotle. This is a very important incident. I will explain later. So in 1160, Ibn Rushd was made the Qadi of Qadi, or the judge of Seville, and then he served in many courts in Andalusia in important position. He was also an expert on Maliki jurisprudence. He was a proper judge. He was a doctor, and he was a philosopher. This is what we call a polymath, isn't it? Now, at that time, in 12th century, the Andalusia was going through some important changes. You know, Andalus was first established, conquered and established by Umayyads, and Abdurrahman I, for example, escapes in 756 and comes to Spain and establishes another Umayyad dynasty after Umayyad Empire collapses and Abbasids replaced them. So that becomes a kind of a beacon of Islamic civilization and in competition with the Abbasids as well. And that goes for a number of centuries, and then these, they split into little taifas or little city-states. So the unity is lost. But then in about 1040, what they call al-Murabitun come from North Africa. These are Berber or North African indigenous people. They establish a state in North Africa and the Western Africa, and then they come into Spain and capture all of the taifas. Basically become the rulers of Spain. And then 1147, when Ibn Rushd is 21 years old, another group comes al-Muwahhidun, and they sort of become rulers of Spain until 1269, and then eventually they also sort of collapse. It goes back to city-states, and then you've got this Reconquista, the recapture of Andalus by the Christian monarchs or kings. And eventually, in 1492, the last remaining city, Granada, falls, and there's no more Andalusia. Andalusia actually, I mean, the Muslims still stay a little bit for about 100 years, severely persecuted. There are a few books written about that, very sad stories. But eventually even Muslims are kicked out. They're first converted first, and then eventually even they don't trust them. Like, for example, one of the things they did was, you look like a Christian, you dress like a Christian. They would prevent these Moors, they call them, staying at home on Fridays, thinking that they could maybe do the Friday prayer at home. You know, they have to go out. They would force them to eat during Ramadan, for example. They were prevented from slaughtering animals themselves. You had to buy it, so that, you know, they couldn't make it halal and so on. Anyway, I just wanted to, it was a pivotal time, but still it was strong Muslim presence in Andalusia. So after Ibn Tufayl made this suggestion, he accepts that Ibn Rushd and spends 30 years of life writing commentaries on Aristotle's works. And he does all of it except the book Republic, which he didn't have a copy. In about 1195, Ibn Rushd falls from favor. Some people don't like al-Muwahhidun. It sounds like, you know, those orthodox or puritanical movements. So there was a lot of those elements. They didn't like philosophy. Actually, Ibn Rushd was writing it a little bit in secret, his works. And eventually, a historian says that there was a secret reason and a more public reason why he was banished. He was actually sent to exile in 1195. He said that the secret reason was when he was writing a commentary on Aristotle's history of animals, he used an expression, and I saw the giraffe at the garden of the king of the Berbers. A normal piece of writing was, you then had to glorify the king a little bit, you know. But he forgot to do that. And a lot of offense was taken at that. The more public reason was, his rivals took some of his writings out of context and took a sentence, and it was shown that Venus is one of the gods. Obviously, that looks like you're attributing Venus, the planet, deifying that. And the ruler called Ibn Rushd, did you write this? He goes, no, I didn't write that, but regardless, he was exiled and banished. His books were ordered to be burnt across the empire, and they were upheld and burnt, unfortunately. So in the Muslim world, unfortunately, writings of Ibn Rushd, especially philosophical writings, don't have any much influence, but in Europe it has a major influence. As I said earlier, he was a polymath. You know, his first writings appear at the age of 31, and he wrote about 80 works, major books, and he wrote on Maliki school of jurisprudence, Islamic theology, Islamic philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, psychology, political theory, geography, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, physics, celestial mechanics, even musical theory. So, but most of his books are on philosophy and medicine, or about half of them. And some of his books are Kitab al-Kulliyat fi al-Tibb, for example. It's generalities in medicine. And Bidayat al-Mujtahid wa Nihayat al-Muqtasid. So this is a distinguished jurist primer. It was a textbook of Maliki jurisprudence. Another book, Asl al-Maqal Fima Bayn al-Hikmah wal-Sharia min Ittisal. And this is a book, basically, it's kind of how to find harmony between Sharia and hikmah meaning science and philosophy. At the time, in 12th century, when people studied hikmah, it included medicine, astronomy, philosophy, like it was all combined under one body of knowledge, just as religious sciences could be combined under Sharia, sort of a literature. So there was the hikmah literature, science, philosophy, and so on, and the Sharia literature. So in this last one, basically, Ibn Rushd is very prominent idea is, as I said earlier, Ibn Tufayl and other Andalusian philosophers, that there's only one truth, and you can get to this truth in two ways: through hikmah, science and philosophy and reason, and knowledge of the universe, and also through Quran or revelation. And they sort of argued that most ordinary people, because they don't have the education and the intellectual capacity of hikmah, they need the revelation. Because revelation puts these truths in simple or simpler terms. But essentially they are the same truth. So in that respect, he's very influential in Europe, and some call him the father of secular Western, philosophy, or secular Western world, really. He has a huge, major impact. And the reason is this idea that I just explained. Because in Europe, prior to Ibn Rushd, or influence of the Muslims, they thought that the only knowledge came from the Bible. That was it. There was no other knowledge. So when you say that, there's truth, and you can get there from religious texts, but also your knowledge of the universe and hikmah and wisdom and so on, that's a major difference or change. And it actually allowed some of these new scholars, or in Europe, to justify studying science. And they used arguments of Ibn Rushd a lot. Like, just to give you a bit of a historical linkage with all of this, remember that when we covered Salahuddin, with the first crusades, which was 1096. And I gave the example of Adelaide or Bath traveling at 1111 to Muslim world, studying for 7 years, which would be 1118. He comes back to Europe and starts translating these works into Latin. So let's say 1120. So by 1120s, books of translations are coming into Europe for the first time. So before Ibn Rushd's works were translated, a lot of the scientific books were translated. So these European scholars now, scientists, are gaining knowledge other than the church, other than what Bible tells them. And it looks like this is better, like it's providing better truth and there's more wisdom in it. So that really challenges the authority of the church. And it's the beginning of what, I wouldn't say secularism, but beginning of the idea that you can challenge the authority of the church in just about, in politics, in knowledge and everything. And that, centuries later produces what we call secular Western world. And the reason why, you can see the trajectory of knowledge transmission as well, can't you? We're talking about Western Europe, we're not talking about Eastern Europe. Western civilization is the Western Europe. You've got Italy, Spain, Britain and England, and to some extent Germany. Because everything came from Andalus, and also through Sicily, Italy as well. Those two paths were very important paths. And there's a lot of books written on how Islam and Islamic civilization influenced the Western world. And Averroes is a key figure in that. Now, when Averroes wrote, commentary on Aristotle's books, philosophy, you think, oh, okay, he wrote his Aristotle's book, he wrote maybe explanations of that. No, he wrote 3 different types of commentaries. The first one was what we call Jami, or explanation of the main ideas. The second one was, he called it the middle commentary, and it was paraphrasing Aristotle, like saying the same things, writing the same books, but in Ibn Rushd's word, a bit more clear, sort of clarifying, just paraphrasing, not adding anything, just writing it differently. And the third one, and this is the amazing part, he goes line by line in Aristotle's work and explains it line by line. So that's the major part of the work. And naturally, when these works are translated into Europe, Latin languages, what do we get? Everything's cooked, ready, because if they just got Aristotle and translated, nobody would understand it. You're getting the full works, Aristotle and all the commentaries and explanations. Everybody is reading that. So everybody who could read and educated reads Ibn Rushd. So they rediscover Aristotle in that way and understand them in the way Ibn Rushd explained it. So actually there was a movement called Averroism. I mean, Ibn Rushd didn't start it, but his people who read his works and were influenced by his explanations created an intellectual movement. And there's 2 major figures in the Christian and Jewish world: Thomas Aquinas and Maimonides. Maimonides is also, he has a Muslim name, Ibn Maymun, who's also from Andalus and later goes to Egypt when, when Jews are kicked out of Spain as well. Maimonides is extremely important it's the Imam Ghazali of the Jews. Now he writes this Mishnah Torah, which is a codification of the Talmud, the whole body of Jewish law, which is about 26 volumes or something like that. And also Maimonides comes up with, in Judaism there was no list of essentials of faith until Maimonides produced 13 articles of Jewish faith. And remarkably, 10 of them are the same as Islam, or very, very close. And the last 3 is about Moses, Moses being the last prophet, Torah being the finality of God's revelation. I mean, obviously, Islam does not accept that. So they're the only differences. Maimonides is influenced by Ibn Rushd and the Averroism and so on. Thomas Aquinas is a major figure in the Christian world. He is also the Imam Ghazali of the Christian world. Thomas Aquinas, he was a philosopher, theologian, and his writings influenced Western thought. So in a way, Judaism, Christianity, and Western secular thought owes its foundations to Ibn Rushd, you could say. It's a very big influence. The Muslim world, not so much, in a way. But there's a very interesting, very famous debate between Imam Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, posthumously, like after Imam Ghazali passes away, because Imam Ghazali wrote a book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, where he laid out about 20 errors and the refutation of 20 ideas of philosophers, in particularly Ibn Sina's writings on philosophy, or metaphysical aspects. Because philosophy is, you should, if you haven't studied it, you probably won't know, but it's got various disciplines as well. It's got logic, it's got linguistics, and it's got metaphysics. It was more of the metaphysical aspects of philosophy that al-Ghazali criticized. So that was a very important book. And actually, al-Muwahhidun, Ibn Tumart, who was a very important, he promoted al-Ghazali. So in those political movements, al-Ghazali was used as a bit of a theological foundations. So in that respect, in the Western Muslim world, Imam Ghazali became very popular before he became famous in the Middle East and elsewhere. So when the Tahawut came to Andalus, Ibn Rushd felt that he had to write a refutation of that. So he called it Tahafut al-Tahafut. Again, later in the Ottoman era, there was an Ottoman scholar, he wrote Tahafut al-Tahafut al-Tahafut. He wrote a refutation of Ibn Rushd as well. So basically there are, very interesting that a debate that takes across centuries. First philosophers say something, Imam Ghazali writes a refutation of that, it's a second layer. Ibn Rushd writes a refutation of Imam Ghazali, and then others write a refutation of Ibn Rushd. Somebody should, there's been a lot of research on that, but it would be really good to bring that to the fore. Maybe we need to write a Tahafut al-Tahafut al-Tahafut al-Tahafut. We'll call that fifth layer of Tahafut. Yeah, I think it would be good to talk about some of these things. Usually we mention it and pass away and we don't explain. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to just briefly touch on the three main ones. Three main ideas that al-Ghazali thought it equated with kufr. He said the other 17 are, mistakes, you could say, but 3 equated with kufr. And these were, 1, eternity of the world, that the world was eternal. There was no bodily resurrection, that resurrection only occurred by spirit. And the third one is that God does not have knowledge of the particulars, he only has knowledge of the universals. And straight away it puts your hair upright, doesn't it, as a sort of a Muslim believer. If you put it that way, it sounds like kufr. But obviously Ibn Rushd disagreed. So let's look at what they said about these three matters. Now, firstly, pre-eternity of the world. Imam Ghazali said that, well, Quran, Imam Ghazali's main emphasis is the Quran. He puts rational arguments as well, but he's really, the reason why he said these three things take you out of religion is because, or it's heresy, it's because it clearly goes against Quran. And he used Quran a lot in his arguments. So for the pre-eternity of the world, he said that, well, the Quran is full of verses where God talks about creating, heavens and the earth, and all in between. And also Quran says in 1851, I did not make them witness the creation of the heavens and the earth, nor the creation of themselves. Nobody saw that. So you won't know how it happened. That's what Quran is saying. And also Imam Ghazali said that if you claim that universe and the world is eternal, it's transferring God's attribute of eternity to created things, which would be shirk. And these are strong arguments, of course. But Ibn Rushd said that in his response, he first criticized Imam Ghazali for misquoting the philosophers. And he said, well, if you put it that way and then argue against it, then it looks like it's correct, but that's not what philosophers really mean when they say these things. By the way, Imam Ghazali, he studied philosophy and he first wrote an introduction to the philosophers' objectives before he wrote the Tahafut. Because he was saying, well, before you can be critical of something, you really have to understand it. So he spent 3 years studying philosophy. So in that respect, he could provide a really strong argument. I mean, Imam Ghazali does provide strong theological and philosophical argument against what Muslim philosophers wrote before al-Ghazali. But Ibn Rushd says, he misquotes and misunderstands them. He said, the universe is created in time. This is what Ibn Rushd is saying. But existence itself, he said, is continuous. It extends continuously in both directions of time. Because he says, to say that nothing existed before universe would mean that there was absolutely nothing existent other than God. And that's like saying God existed together with pure nothingness, because they thought that that was absurd. So basically it's saying that just because universe has a beginning and it may have an end, it doesn't mean that existence itself has began and end with the beginning of the universe. Like things existed before the universe and things will exist after the universe ends. Can you appreciate that? Also Ibn Rushd said that there are like verses in the Quran like 11:7 which talks about God creating heavens and earth, and his arsh, separately he mentions arsh, which is a greater plane of existence than the universe. That existed prior to the universe existence. But we don't talk about arsh, being created. The Quran doesn't mention that, he says. And that also in chapter Quran 14:48, it talks about, Quran says that the earth will be substituted with another world, earth. And then you will give an account of your lives. It's like there's another world that will exist, different but like this world. So basically he's saying that time and existence precedes the universe, and time and existence will continue after the universe and the world ends existence. So, I mean, yeah, you could say both has a point, in that respect. But definitely, the science proved Imam Ghazali right, in a sense that, we have a Big Bang is proven, that there was a point in time when universe was not there and it existed. But once again, to say that nothing existed before the existence of the universe may be absurd, and we just don't know. And and the second point is the knowledge of the particulars. Al-Ghazali says that, well, Quran clearly says that not even a leaf falls without the knowledge of God. And so the Quran is full of verses that indicate God knows little things as well. And also he says that to claim that God does not know particulars is limiting God's knowledge. Well, philosophers thought that, if we say that God knows particular things, those particular things always change. And they thought that would equate to God's knowledge changing, which, again, is absurd, according to them. So Imam Ghazali is saying that if we say God does not know the particulars, it's like saying God is limited in his knowledge as well. That's also wrong. Or if we say that God does not need to know the particulars, because philosophers also argued that point, he says that's also very wrong, because a lot of the purposes in creation and the creativity of God is expressed in the particulars, like in a flower, for example, or in a little bird and a little butterfly. Those are little things, but a lot of the creativity is displayed through those things. So he said, well, actually, it's essential that God would know the particulars. Well, Ibn Rushd responded saying that, he said that, well, there's a distinction between knowledge of humans and knowledge of God. And they should not be confused. And he's saying that the philosophers are focusing on God's knowledge rather than human knowledge. Because Ibn Rushd says, for example, if you throw a cannon and it moves in a particular projectile, we have to calculate that in order to understand that motion. But God created the laws that govern that motion. So he doesn't need to observe things for God to know how motion occurs. I mean, he's trying to make the point that we look at the particular things to understand things, and then we're projecting that knowledge onto God. So God needs to know these particular things in order to understand and govern the universe. So he's saying it's not necessary. God knows everything, and also if a person's God knows everything about a person's life, so his knowledge really doesn't change. So you can see that, sometimes I think at least Ibn Rushd, what he's doing is that, because people tend to, based on Imam Ghazali's refutation, people tend to dismiss all of philosophy and all philosophers as mushriks or kafirs, heretics. But he's really saying that they have a very sophisticated understanding of things, and that should not be confused with heresy. And it doesn't mean that they are really wrong. Because they're not denying God's knowledge, they're not denying God's creation of the world. If they were to deny that, yeah, that would be kufr. It's just that they're interpreting it differently. Bodily resurrection, okay, this is Quran, once again, Imam Ghazali says the Quran is full of verses that talk about bones coming back to life, bones being clothed with flesh. And so the Quran is talking about a resurrection of body and the soul, spirit. And Imam Ghazali criticizes philosophers focusing on hadith that talks about more like a spiritual existence or very different existence. For example, there's a verse in Bukhari which says, hadith narrated by Bukhari, it says, I have reserved for my most virtuous worshippers what no eye has seen and no ear has heard, and which the heart of no man cannot conceive. So philosophers are saying, well, it's completely different. To say that body and spirit are resurrected together, it would mean that it will look exactly like this. But the hadith is saying it's not. Imam Ghazali says, but there's also hadith that talks about punishment in grave, things like that, that really, and being rewarded in paradise, the fruits, that these look like the same as what we had on earth. There are verses like that. So basically, Imam Ghazali is saying resurrection will be body and the spirit. And this is by the way, the orthodox position in Islamic theology. Well, Ibn Rushd, again, he says, well, philosophers are misunderstood in this respect, because he says none of the philosophers say that resurrection is not going to occur. Because denial of resurrection would be kufr, but interpreting how it will happen would not be kufr. And he says, well, resurrection will certainly, or bodily resurrection is certainly possible, but it will not be the same as this body that we have. And he refers to the analogy of the Quran, when it compares sleep with death. You're sleeping, the body looks, immobile, but the spirit experiences things. So he's saying that spirit, you don't need the body to experience things, pleasure and pain, because Imam Ghazali was saying, it is in this body. What makes us human is the body and the spirit, and people, do good things with this body. People also do sins with this body. So punishment and reward will also be in the body. Like fire, the hell's going to have fire. Fire burns physical things. That's what Imam Ghazali is saying. But Ibn Rushd is saying, well, it's really, what is really experiencing pain and pleasure? It's the spirit. So you don't really need a physical body to experience it. Or even if you get a physical body, it doesn't have to be like the one we have. It can be completely different. Yeah, so, well, at the end of it, it comes down to what we call, I don't want to bore you with these philosophical and theological stuff, but I'll just finish with the real debate comes down to what we call causality. Causality as does cause and effect exist, really? And in Ash'ari theology, or in Ash'ari Orthodox theology, cause and effect doesn't exist. Basically, for every moment in time, universe goes into extinction, or universe does not exist, and then it's brought back into existence a little bit differently by God. So by God's will and power, the entire universe comes back to existence. So everything has to be willed by God every moment. because we see this, it happens so fast, we see it continuous. By the way, the speed of causality is speed of light. The fastest a thing can happen is with the speed of light. So imagine like that fast, naturally you're not going to perceive being non-existent. So just like a movie, even in movies, I think 24 frames per second, isn't it? 24 or 40? 40 frames per second. You project that onto screen, you perceive that as movement. So imagine frames to the, 600,000 frames in 1 second as the speed of light, something like that. It'll be far greater resolution, put it that way. So basically, Imam Ghazali argues that when you eat something, it satisfies your hunger, but doesn't have to be there's no guarantee. You put the pot to cook something with fire, it's not the fire that really cooks it. It's the will of Allah, will and power of Allah. It's just that we perceive it that way. It's a bit like if I explain, if you're watching a screen, let's say a soccer player playing football, and the soccer player is hitting the ball, is there really a ball and a soccer player hitting the ball? Really no, isn't it? We are seeing it that way. It's really a projection. So that's kind of like the Ash'ari view. That's called occasionalism or atomism. So basically, but Ibn Rushd argued that, he said that, well, God has established causes as conditions of things to exist. So causes don't create, but they're conditions. Well, Imam Ghazali argued that as well later in Ihya Ulumuddin, so it's really not much different. But in the Tahawud, it's different. God could satisfy, surely, God could satisfy hunger without food, and God could cook things without fire, and so on. But He doesn't normally do so. It doesn't normally happen that way. When things happen without causes, we call them miracles. And then he says that cause and effect are critical to our knowledge of the world. And if you don't acknowledge that, you would have to deny all knowledge that you acquire. So that was his argument back. This cause and effect causality issue is a big issue, and it relates to how we frame the world and science and so on. Very interesting. So again, I want to say that we should not dismiss. You can choose obviously Imam Ghazali represents the orthodox theology, and it's based on the Quran perhaps more obviously than what philosophers were talking about. Personally, I don't think universe is eternal. We don't know what existed before, what will exist after. The universe ends and finishes, but science tells us that the universe definitely had a beginning. Actually, time started with Big Bang, and it will end. And the Quran is very clear on, yes, we could say that the body that we will be created with may not be exactly the same as this, because this body, changes, gets old and dies. It has to be altered for an eternal life. But it could definitely look like flesh and blood. It's just that they say that, the reason why we get old is that there's this tail end of the DNA. Every time a cell is split, that tail becomes shorter. It gets shorter, shorter, and shorter. There comes a point when a cell splits, it cannot split anymore. So it just dies. That basically you get old because of that. So basically, if you remove that functionality from DNA that it can replicate forever, you can have a kind of like a body for eternity, isn't it? Everlasting. I mean, God can certainly alter His own creation and make it last for a long time. I mean, stars last for billions of years. Yeah. So, and you know, God certainly knows every little thing, according to Quran. But at the same time, how does you know, causal and laws of creation and causality work? That's a bit of a mystery and needs to be really investigated by Muslim scientists and philosophers at the same time. Maybe we can find like to say that God is the creator of the laws and things occur according to those laws is not heresy, really, is it? Okay, well, that's the contribution of Ibn Rushd. He's a major, not only a major great figure in the Muslim world, he is a great figure for the Western world. He is kind of like the bridge between Islam and the West. And he died in 1198 in Marrakesh, the Moroccan city, and his body was moved to Cordoba and buried together with his family in 1198. May Allah have mercy on his soul and ours as well. Ameen wa alhamdulillah. Yeah. We'll have the questions before we break, sorry.
Assalamu alaikum. In some books they say that the reason why the West has progress is because they follow the path of Ibn Rushd, and the reason why the Muslim world is backward is because they follow the path of al-Ghazzali. So what is the crux of the argument? Like, how would you tackle something like that? Is it because of this causality argument that because sometimes they say Imam Ghazali's approach was more like, oh, okay, just believe in God, trust in God, you know, causality doesn't exist. But Ibn Rushd was more about, you know, you got to do things so you can see results. He was more about rationality, things like that. Is it just that, or are there other arguments in regards to it?
Look, there's definitely a shift in the Muslim world and the Western world to the opposite. In the Muslim world, knowledge was seen as a whole, holistic, and everything was studied: science, philosophy, theology, you know, Islamic jurisprudence. What happened was, but there was always a strain in the Muslim world, like from all the way to the beginning, you know, the Kharijites, a puritanical element that was against science and philosophy. It was always there. But they could not justify their position. And it could not be institutionalized. Because there was freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, and so on. But with Imam Ghazali's critique of philosophy, with this tahafut, these puritanical elements took that as a evidence and explained to masses of Muslims in very simplistic terms why it's haram and kufr to study philosophy. As we just seen, it's not the case. And Imam Ghazali really did not put that idea across. Actually, Imam Ghazali is responsible for legitimizing use of philosophy in theology. Because before him, Kalam was always kind of seen as a bit of a no-no discipline. But what he does is that he takes all the useful elements of philosophy and injects it into theology. Logic, you know, contextual analysis, reasoning, and so on. And leaves out what he considered is harmful to theology or beliefs. And actually the madrasas, the Nizamiya madrasas that were established with the Seljuks and Imam Ghazali becoming the chief architect, they studied everything, you know, science, philosophy, and religious sciences. Like philosophy was taught in madrasas for centuries. Even today, when you go to Pakistan, you know, you study in a madrasa, they'll tell you you ask, what is the world made out of? They'll say fire, air, earth, and water. This actually comes from philosophy. It's Aristotle's views, you know. And they'll be totally against philosophy and Aristotle if you ask them that. But when you ask, what's the world made out of, they'll give you that answer. If they haven't studied, you know, chemistry and so on. So it was really in there. What really happened was later madrasas got all of that science and philosophy was taken out. Some of the ideas stayed there, approaches and so on, but it was taken out, unfortunately. And in the end, we had no science, no proper, you know, investigation of the world. And it happened very slowly. I mean, Imam Ghazali died 1111, and by 13th, 14th centuries, there were still, the Muslim scientists were producing original works. It's just that Baghdad was destroyed in 1258 with Mongol invasion. Sicily was a very important place, was invaded by Europeans. Andalus was lost completely. And then initially it went to science, or being a center of science, it went to Syria and then also Central Asia. And later came into Ottoman Empire, like when Fatih Sultan Mehmet in 1453, when he conquered Constantinople, he built a massive mosque and a kulliyah, which had a university and madrasas, you know. He brought Ulugh Bey from Central Asia. He was an astronomer and famous scientist into Istanbul to start up a whole new, you know, system there. But in the end, eventually, these puritanical elements won over. You know, famously in 1582, when an observatory was built in Istanbul, brand new, just 4 years ago, it was destroyed by these puritanical scholars who were really influential, and Sultan could not do anything. And it was built by Sokolu Mehmet Pasha, who was very progressive for his time. He was kind of a genius. There was always those two elements were, but in the end, that conservatism and Puritanism became dominant in the Muslim world, and all these books were either ignored, burned, and they were not studied. Whereas in the Western world, for a long time, for about 1,000 years, almost, Bible was the only source of knowledge. Everything else was dismissed and forgotten. And when they discovered science and philosophy meaning thinking properly, you know, reasoning properly, and trying to discover what is really truth. It's critical thinking. They learned it from Muslims, these things. And when it came to Europe, it challenged the establishment. Thomas Aquinas is really, in his time, he died in 1274. You know, this kind of Averroism was very dominant, and these universities was established, independent centers of learning in Europe, and they were influential by then. And then he had to respond to all of that. Sort of, Thomas Aquinas is responsible to bring reason and proper theology into Christian world. What he called natural theology. It basically is an influence from Ibn Rushd and Muslim theologians. So it was reversed, and then there comes a time when Galileo famously puts his telescope into the skies. They called it the spyglass telescope, yeah, because they could look at the ships before they appeared on the horizon. They could see it 2 hours earlier, and that meant that you could see your enemies and prepare, or a trade ship that was waited. If you saw it, you know, you could take precaution. So it gave you advantage. You had intelligence. And so it was called the spyglass. Galileo did not invent it, but he was smart enough to point it into the sky and have a look at the stars. You know, he thought, oh, okay, it's making me see the ships closer. Let me look at the moon. And when he looks at it, because Thomas Aquinas, because he brought in the Aristotle and all of that philosophical knowledge and made it part of the Christian theology, one of Aristotle's view was, for example, that every spherical object, or the heavenly objects are perfectly spherical. But when you look at Galileo's book on celestial objects, his drawing of moon, it's all crooked. He's got mountains, he's got craters, and because he saw that, you know, with his telescope. Now, who's he going to believe? Aristotle, Plato, or what he's seeing? And naturally, and then even some scientists, they said, well, they don't want to abandon, because what they know, it's very difficult, what you believe is true, to abandon it. So they thought, well, moon looks that way, there is a layer of transparent matter. That makes it perfectly spherical. It's just that we don't see the transparent matter. You know, I mean, people, you know, evolve in their learning and knowledge in that way. And then he looked at the Jupiter. He realized that Jupiter had moons. Hey, wait a minute. We thought that everything was revolving around the Earth. But the moons are not, at least the moons of Jupiter are not. So that shatters the whole thing. Really, then the church famously trials in Inquisition Galileo and asked him to reverse, deny all the things that he knows. What they were really insisting was that the church probably did not care what was really happening, but they wanted to make the point that the church is ultimately holds the truth, claim to truth. And he in Galileo was saying that we can get the truth independent of the church. So basically, all these secular ideas evolve in response to church's reaction to what they were learning from science and philosophy. And so to keep the integrity of the church and the theology, Christian theology, and the integrity of scientific knowledge, they had to come up with saying, Descartes, for example, said there's a difference between mind and the spirit. They are of different type, substance, and different areas of knowledge. So you cannot know the spirit through the mind, and you cannot know what mind knows through the spirit. So basically, knowledge was separated into two with that. And that is the beginning of the secular ideas. But essentially, all of that goes to Ibn Rushd and his writings. I don't know if that answers. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Any other question?
Just maybe you can just comment on it, talking about the bodily resurrection. There's a proof of that in a hadith about that we're going to be resurrected not in exactly the same bodies we have now, about the time when Prophet Salahuddin was talking to that old lady and telling her that there's no old ladies in heaven, in Jannah. And she got sad and he said, well, you're going to be resurrected in a young body. So that would go to prove, or prove to that. Huh?
Prove which one?
Well, it proves, actually, it kind of proves both of them, because it's saying that we are resurrected, but not in the same body, in a different body.
Actually, you can combine both views. You can say that it will be a bodily physical resurrection where spirit returns back to the body, but it's in a different body. So you cannot we cannot really say that it will be exactly this body. Yeah. It will be a different physical form, which may make it look like we have this. I mean, there's a lot of hadith that gives, for example, if a ring of a person of paradise comes down to earth, it would blind everybody with light, if just a ring. And normally ring doesn't radiate light, right? But so we're talking about a different plane of existence, perhaps. Perhaps still matter, like there's some sort of a matter, but maybe it's just the fifth form of matter, I don't know. But definitely it's different and more fitting for an eternal life. Or we should say everlasting life. There's a difference between everlasting and eternity. Meaning like eternal is only, comes from itself, that Allah can be only eternal, whereas being everlasting is only by the leave of Allah that we will last forever.